This is another video about death and the nature of self, an issue that immediately gets right to the core of reality and philosophy. In particular, this is another video in a series of videos on this channel which is highly critical of mainstream Buddhism. My last video on this subject was in response to the teachings of a mainstream Theravadan Buddhist monk, and some of the commenters remarked that this monk didn't represent all Buddhists. So today I'll be responding to the teachings of a mainstream Tibetan monk to demonstrate that extreme nonsense is almost ubiquitous throughout all forms of modern Buddhism. The following clips are from a teaching by a monk by the name of George Churinoff.
Mind is of a different nature than the body. So it's not synonymous with physical, is not even emergent from that physical, dependent upon the physical to exist, but of a different nature.
In the beginning of that clip, he said that mind is of a different nature than the body. Now that's not too offensive in itself, because we do have a word, mind, and we also have a word, body, and if you look those words up in the dictionary, you find that those words have different definitions. So therefore, mind and body aren't synonyms, and we could say that mind and body have different natures. Then critically, he said that mind is not emergent from the physical. It is not dependent on the physical to exist, but it is of a different nature. So he thinks that because mind and body have different natures, then the body can't possibly be a cause of the mind. To him, mind and body must be causally separate and completely independent entities. But if the mind is independent of the physical, then how can mind-altering drugs alter the mind? Does the mind alter itself just to fool us into believing that drugs were somehow responsible? And if the mind was independent of the physical, then how could it ever know about the existence of the physical world? How could we be aware that a bus is about to run us over, or that we are thirsty and need to drink? Clearly, the mind is not independent of the physical world. Otherwise, it couldn't be aware of these things. The mind is only aware of the physical world because of the effect that the physical world has on the mind. For example, your mind is aware of the words I'm speaking right now because of the sounds coming out of your speakers. So this is absolute proof that the mind is not independent of the physical. And it's proof that the monk has no idea what he's talking about. Now let's further explore his statement that the mind is of a different nature to the body. And I'll use the example of water and ice, since ice is of a different nature to water, having different properties, and that's the reason it has a different name. And yet ice is nothing other than frozen water, which is to say that one of the causes of ice is water. Likewise with the difference between mind and body. Mind and body have different properties, and we distinguish them with different names, like water and ice. And yet mind is a product of the body and is a function of the body. If you take away the water from ice, then you no longer have any ice. And in the same way, if you take away the body from the mind, then there is no longer any mind. In this next clip, the monk reaffirms that, in his opinion, which he arrogantly calls the Buddhist opinion, mind cannot arise from the body, but can only come from previous mind. So the two are eternally separate.
The consciousness at the time of birth has to have come not from the union of the fertilized egg, the union of the father's sperm and mother's egg, or any chemicals that were added at the time, but if it's of a different nature, the material, it had to be had a previous continuity of a similar kind before. Conscious continuity.
So, he says that consciousness can only come from consciousness. Following that reasoning, then ice can't possibly come from water, since ice is of a different nature to water, having different properties. Ice can only come from ice. Ice continuity, he would call it. If it were true that ice could only ever come from ice, then ice would be permanent, without beginning or end. But ice isn't like that. Ice is a conditioned phenomena, made up of various components and dependent on many factors. A little bit of heat and the ice is gone, much like this monk's arguments. Our death is very much like the melting of ice, or it's like a cloud dissolving in the clear sky. Next, the monk argues that just because there's no evidence for reincarnation doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Scientists, physicists, chemists, biologists, in the laboratory with their instruments, they don't perceive past lives. This is the doubt that comes in our mind. I don't, scientists don't, none of them, quote, hard scientists, or the people I consider my gurus, not these wafty religious people. None of them perceive past and future lives, so therefore they don't exist. But ask yourself, is it sufficient to say that something is not perceived? Does that necessitate that it doesn't exist?
From a purely scientific perspective, yes. If there's no evidence for the existence of something, then science says, tentatively, that it doesn't exist. For example, if there's no shred of evidence for the existence of the invisible pink unicorn, then we don't believe in the existence of such a thing. That's how science works. But it's not just scientists who don't perceive past lives. I'm a philosopher, and some would say a mystic of sorts, and yet I've never perceived any past lives. I've certainly perceived some of the causes of what makes me what I am, such as my genetics, or the teachings and experiences I've learned from throughout life, but I've never perceived a past life as a particular fish or a particular person. In fact, I've never met any thinking person, scientist or not, who has ever perceived past lives. Even the Dalai Lama, one of the leading figures in Tibetan Buddhism, says that he can't remember any past lives, and he goes on to say that he can't remember ever having remembered past lives at any time in his life. In any case, even if a person does believe they can remember past lives, it doesn't mean that it's true. So why is this monk speaking such nonsense? My very closing remarks are going to be on the subject of decency in teaching. If a person doesn't know what they're talking about, if they don't know that what they're teaching is in fact true, then they shouldn't be teaching it. This is just basic human decency, but it obviously hasn't found its way into the halls and traditions of Buddhism. If you know a little bit, then by all means you should teach that little bit. This is called creating a small, warm fire. If you teach only what you personally know to be true, then you can't go wrong, and the world will be a much better place. Don't follow the example of these Buddhist teachers. If you need my warning, then be warned.